I'm going to give some context. I used to live in Slate Springs, Minnesota as a kid. I lived in the middle of nowhere with a giant meadow field about 5 miles long by 7 miles wide. I looked at my old house just to make sure it's correct. Our closest neighbor owned some of it and stored giant cylindrical hay bales there. I clearly remember it being my birthday and it was very cold outside. I had just turned 7 and was playing on my plastic little four-wheeler and I got a stick stuck in the wheel, so I got off and picked it off. I remember getting up and looking up to see a giant bird fly over the giant field in front of my house and landed on a hay bale, and it was clearly almost 3 times the size of a hay bale. I remember freezing and then watching as it took off, almost crushing the bale. I then went running inside crying, but parents thought I was talking about a raven or something. Has anyone else seen something similar? About a month ago, I told my dad about it, and he said he remembered the neighbor saying something about a bird. This is my very own up-and-close personal account with a Thunderbird. I live in Canada, in the province of Ontario. It took place mid-December of 2011, around 4 a.m., and it was shaping up to be a very green Christmas, as there wasn't snow on the ground at the time. Me, my brother, and a close friend went to smoke a joint out on my balcony, as I live on a mid-upper floor of an apartment building. As we spark the joint, I see this dark black silhouette moving on top of the willow tree, which is on the building property. FYI, my balcony has the best view of it as I see this silhouette fluttering on the top crown canopy of the willow. I grab my brother and friend's attention, asking them if they can make out what the hell I'm seeing, which was a big WTF moment. Thought it was a big black tarp being animated by wind flow. Once all 3 of us locked into what we were seeing, things like wings, a neck, and the structure of a bird became very apparent. This thing seemed very restless as it kept pacing around the top canopy of the willow. During this time, cell phones had really crappy night support cameras, as I'm sure many of you might remember. Trying to take videos at night with an iPhone 3GS, BlackBerry Bold LG, and early Android smartphones, if zoomed in, were left horrible, grainy rubbish. We tried to capture it on camera from my balcony, which yielded the above-mentioned results. All 3 of us ran down to the ground floor. Man, the mere presence of this animal keeps your soul frozen. It's like you can't fathom something like this being thrown to you, visually. It was in that moment that led me to discover what our natural high is in this world. And trust me, whatever effects the weed had yielded long dissipated from when I thought I was looking at a black tarp caught onto the top of the tree. My bro and our friends made it about 6 feet away from the door that leads out from the building. These guys weren't really mentally prepared for something like this, as they both tripped over each other from keeping their eyes glued to it. This animal is quite frightening, especially when you have to come to terms with the reality you now share with it, knowing it's living and breathing as you are. I chose to proceed closer to the tree until I got about 5 feet from it. I couldn't approach any closer, as it shrieked a sound so intimidating and loud. It sounded like an eagle on steroids, but much deeper and sharper in terms of its pitches. I distinctly remember it going into a crouched position, with its tail up, and its head charging downwards with its wings up halfway, opened and curled upwards. This bird is all black, with some red feathering near the face. Never felt that specific feeling of fear before. I ran back towards my bro and friend, and the bird continued to get more restless and aggressive. It literally flapped its wings, hopped up to the next building, which is about 4 stories high, with the willow is about 7 stories, and the distance between both places are less than 15 feet. It paced around there, agitated, then flew off again and disappeared. The wingspan was definitely 16 plus feet easily, and it was about 10 feet tall. A lot of people share this type of experience with themselves. Well, I was lucky enough to share it with 2 others. We told a few of our other friends, and surprisingly, they believed us. I became really obsessed with finding answers. I even thought about calling the avian people who oversee the birds and wildlife, but didn't want them to think we were crazy or lying. Definitely found things that helped me understand more about the Thunderbird in my experience. One thing that stood out the most was that it was at nighttime. I feel like it's evolved and adapted to being nocturnal, and that's why it goes unnoticed during the day. Never seen another bird that active, let alone be in clear sight during the night, besides owls or even bats. Alright, I got 2 stories for you. First, about 17 years ago, break in a nasty storm, about 9 p.m. in mid-October. My dad and I went out to survey the damage, see if anything had been taken care of before morning. Moon was just about full, above 2 thin layers of cloud, moving in different directions. Looked cool. My dad noticed it first, told me to look up, saw something dark flying above the first layer of clouds, which, even if they were low, would still have been ridiculously high. It passed in front of the moon. Sounds cheesy, I know, and the silhouette was that of a bird. Looked like some sort of raptor. The tips of its wings extended beyond the width of the moon. It must have been massive. Second, I don't know if it was a Thunderbird, but whatever. I seen was a few years ago, and it was about 3 a.m. on a winter night. I couldn't sleep, so I went out for a cigarette and was casually looking around, and it was dead quiet. Not too surprising, because usually around that time it's always dead quiet, because I live in a small northern town. But as I was puffing on my smoke, something caught my eye. The town lights were reflecting on the clouds that I see a huge bird, but this looked like a grayish color. The thing's wingspan must have been more than twice the size of my arm. With a long body, we have owls here, but they are small and turn white in winter. Whatever it was scared the crap out of me, and I rushed inside, making sure to quietly close my door. Then, just stared out of the front window for the next hour, staring into the sky. One night, when I was like 7 or 8, I went onto the roof of my house with my dad and brother to lie down. After about 30 minutes of talking and looking at the stars, we heard a noise that sounded like flapping. Then, we saw a huge bird. I mean, this thing was massive, with a wingspan of maybe 25 to 30 feet. It just flew overhead and into the distance. We never saw it again, though we were pretty spooked. We thought it might have been a condor since they have a pretty massive wingspan, but from doing some research, we found out there are no condors in Texas, and they don't get as big as the bird we saw, so we weren't really sure. We often tell this story to friends. Obviously, some don't believe or don't want to, and others are intrigued by the whole thing. And one of them even said that we saw sounds similar to the Thunderbird, which is a creature from Native American legend whose wings are responsible for causing thunder. I don't know about that, but the sounds of the bird's wings flapping still gives me chills to this day. Whether it really was a Thunderbird or a condor or some species of a giant bird, I'm not sure. But I know what I saw, as cliche as this is to say, it's the truth. I don't know what it was, but I'm more curious than scared. Did I see a Thunderbird? A new species of giant bird. It was heading west from what I remember that night, towards New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. So maybe its home is in the valleys and cliffs and caves over there. Like I said, I don't know. If anyone has any information on this or has had a similar experience, I would appreciate it if you could share it. I don't know what to believe, honestly. There's the part that wants to believe in the stories of the Thunderbird, but the other logical side is trying to tell me otherwise. But there's always that what if. What do you think? I have some information on the bird situation. In 2001, my husband and I were driving outside of New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, late one night. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning. We had received a call that someone may have spotted our lost beagle. It was October, and we had a quiet moment while we were driving down this dusky country road. The moon was out and did light things up, but it was still dusk-like. All of a sudden, we heard a bird fly above us. It swooped down, soaring above our SUV. We thought it landed on our vehicle because we sort of lifted up a little off the road. Our windows were down, and the bird came so close to our vehicle that we can hear it soar back up. It kind of lifted us up, or felt like it anyway. We both looked at each other and said, "What was that?" We looked up in the sky, and a huge grayish-white-like bird with a wingspan of about 13 to 16 feet soared to a nearby white tree without leaves. It blended in so well, the bird disappeared when it landed on the limb. The tree looked petrified and dead-like. I said to my husband, "That is the biggest bird I have ever seen in my life." I called it the Birdman because its legs were so long and dangled like a man's legs. We came home and told our children, who are teenagers, the following morning, and they laughed at us. It almost looked prehistoric. I still find it hard to believe what we saw. When I came home from work this morning, my husband told me he heard about this big bird thing on Coast to Coast. I'm glad we here are not the only ones who have seen this amazing bird. Back in 1996, me and my then girlfriend at the time saw what we believed to be a Thunderbird. Being from nearby and traveling a lot through the surrounding states, you tend to pick up on some information and learn a few things here and there, especially from befriending locals and tribesmen alike. The desert is a dangerous place, and much of it is unknown to man. Even many of the natives wouldn't venture to some parts, and that is saying a lot. Let me get back to the story. So, back in 1996, we're driving along Highway 85 when my girlfriend taps me on the shoulder and points off to her side of the car, which is the passenger side. She's asking me, "Do you see that out there?" I briefly glanced over, and out of the distance, you could see this large bird flying low to the ground. Far enough away that you couldn't make out specific details, but close enough you could tell that it was a bird, and very large in size. My first thought was that it was a condor, or some sort of large bird of prey, but as it ascended back into the sky and flew off in the distance, it was clear this was not the case. This thing had black feathers and resembled more of a large raven kind of bird than anything else. It did look different than a raven though. I want to establish that. As it ascended, you can kind of make out a little bit more of its body, and I remember clear as day white markings on its tail area. The whole sighting maybe lasted 10 seconds at most, but it left my girlfriend and I in awe and wonder that such birds of size live out here in the desert. I could have never imagined birds that big to exist. It's really hard to put a size on it, but I could tell it was larger than the car I was in at the time, which was my 1993 Nissan Sentra. It was a very, very large-sized bird. That's for sure. I was invited out to a friend's house a few years back, south of Phoenix. He lives kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but one of the main directions he gave me at the time was that there was a large cattle farm near where he was. He said that this cattle rancher had a bad habit of not being careful enough and, more often than not, would have cattle wander off and die. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to see dead cattle off in the distance. Well, he wasn't wrong. On my way to his house, I probably saw at least 3 dead cows on my way there. This is the same time that I also saw the largest bird in my entire life. Out not too terribly far away from the road was this monstrous-sized white bird, eating away at this dead cow that must have wandered off too far and died. The bird was easily the size of the cattle, and it was certainly a sight to behold. I couldn't stop staring, even while trying to maintain eyes on the road. The entire time I was trying to grasp what kind of bird gets that big. It wasn't at all trying to conceal itself in any way, just feasting away at this dead cow. There were other cars on the road as well, so I'm sure I was not the only one to see it. It was in plain sight, you just had to look off in that direction. It was pulling massive chunks of meat off its bones. It never flew away, just kept feasting of the meat on this cow. I got to my friend's place eventually and told him, "You have giant birds around here that are eating off the dead cows." And I remember he just kind of gave me a blank stare. I don't think he ever knew how to respond. He asked me what I was talking about, and I explained what I saw. I don't think he really believed me. Here I just thought I saw a bird that might be a normal thing around the area, but I guess not. I wouldn't be surprised if all the dead cattle lying around brought in scavenger animals of all kinds. Maybe that was the situation. I don't know. I'm not familiar with any of the species of birds that live out here in the desert, but it was an animal sighting I won't forget. My great-grandfather was a very passionate outdoors man. Well, he still is. Hunter, survivalist, woodsman expert. You know, the kind of guy who lives for the outside world of exploration and adventure. The kind of guy who regularly spends weeks out on hikes at a time and spends more time in solitude than others. He's survived in multiple climates, terrains, and states for that matter, and even other countries. At the age of 103, he's still going for it, incredibly healthy, and a very alert mind. He tells me the secret to his longevity and health is being constantly active and putting in good food into your body. But anyway, he's told me about some things he's found on his adventures before, and nothing is ever too out there. In the last 6 months, I learned of something called the Thunderbird, which is supposedly this large bird that is said to show up before and after a storm. And I was telling my great-grandfather about it and my interest in it, and he told me a couple of different stories. The first was back in the 60s when he was doing a 40-mile hike through the outback of Southern California. Listen, I know it's technically not called the outback, but that's what I like to call it. It's harsh, barren wilderness, so it makes sense. This man will do these kinds of hikes to 1. Stay in shape, and 2. Push his body to its limits to prove he can do it. At one point during his trek, he was attacked by a bird of angelic size that nearly grabbed my great-grandfather in its talons and carried him away. He said that even this bird dwarfed that condor or other large birds. He was able to burn it with a torch he had at the time and scared it off. It was clear that its intent was to kill him. Said the bird was large, built like an eagle, but had very distinctive features to its face. I thought this detail was interesting, that its claws and beak were black, and it looked to have intelligence in its eyes, more than other birds. He even claimed that it came down from the higher Rocky Mountains, probably for hunting a meal, for its young. The second experience he had was when he had reached the end of a 3-week hiking expedition in southern Nevada, and found what he described as a feather the size of his torso. It was the largest feather he had ever encountered in his life. Said it measured about 4 feet in length and about 10 inches in width. He kept the feather with him for years until he lost everything he owned in a house fire years ago that nearly claimed his life back in the early 80s. I fully believe him. He's not the type to make up stuff like this and is a very honest and hardworking man who comes from the time area where honesty is valued. I haven't asked him about Bigfoot or anything else he might have encountered on his journeys, but I might have to sit down one of these days and pick his brain to find out more if he's got any good stories. He's still out and about doing his thing in the wild, so I don't get as much of a chance to talk to him as I would like. I'll never forget about the time that I went camping with my family in Northern California, where my brother saw something he will never forget. I know that Northern California is home to a lot of things. Giant redwoods, dangerous animals, even the supposed Bigfoot, but I never in a million years would have thought this animal existed. Now, I didn't really think much of this whole phenomenon at the time because I was simply too young and not aware of it. Well, I didn't really spend a lot of time looking into it until my brother sat me down and really told me about it. See, my family loves to just get in a motorhome, and we drive around to different states and find great spots to camp out, whether it be a campground or just off the beaten path. It doesn't really matter to us. We'll find a way to have a good time, no matter what. In this instance, we were driving around Northern California, and I could tell you that I remember we were near the redwoods at the time. I can't quite remember if we had gone through them yet, or if we already did, In fact, I probably couldn't even tell you the exact spot because I was much younger, but I remember that it was that dry desert kind of woods. If you're having a hard time following along, just simply Google what the terrain is like in northern Cali, and you'll get an idea. It's not thick woods like in the Pacific Northwest. It's more dried out. Anyway, we decided to make our camp spot off the road we were on. There was nobody else around, and we figured it would be the perfect place. As we're getting set up, my parents sent my brother to see if he can find a nearby stream to pitch some water, because we were running low at the time. My brother was 17 then, and was already a very experienced outdoors kind of kid. He carried a knife on him all the time and was very knowledgeable about his general surroundings. It's not like my parents just sent their kid off in the woods without knowing anything. They raised him well. I think my father even spotted a small stream just a few miles away on the way up and wanted to see if it wrapped around. About 20 minutes later, my brother comes back, pale as a ghost, and says that he's seen the largest bird to have ever exist, on prehistoric levels. My parents give him a puzzled look, but I think they ultimately just wrote it off, and probably said something along the lines of, he probably just mistook a big bird or something. What he explained to me was that it was a giant raven-like bird, but larger than him. It always really stood out to me, because my brother doesn't get scared easily, especially being out in the wilderness so much. We've been out in the woods together since we were just little kids, and to him, that's just a part of nature. Even the times that he's come across mountain lions and even bear, he's hardly fazed because he's just accepted that's just a part of being out in the wild. But this was something that really bothered him, and I distinctly remember him acting different the rest of the day. It was bothersome. The day did go on though, and we ended up getting busy with just camping and living, and so before you know it, we're on our way out of there, and life continues to go on. One thing that's interesting is that my family and I did hear what sounded like a very large hawk very close by. If you know the sound of a hawk, you'll probably understand what I mean. Except the sound of this hawk was so loud. You know how you can tell when you hear an animal sound the general size of it? It's just common sense to know that if it's a larger animal, it's going to have more bass and fullness in its roar, cry, howl, whatever the sound the animal makes. Well, there's a couple of times in that nearby area afterwards we had heard what sounded like a hawk, but much deeper, and sounded like it belonged to a bird much larger. Again, the best way I can describe it accurately is that it had much more bass and vibration to its cry. I guess if you want to call it a hawk cry. I thought it was cool at the time, but I don't really think I put two and two together. The years went on, and my brother and I got to talking again, and he brings up this event. But this time, he went into far greater detail, explaining that as he was traversing down to this ravine to look for the stream, he saw what he described as a mixture of a raven and a hawk, except much larger than him. He said this thing's legs and talons were easily as big as his forearms and hands. Said the head and beak was larger than his own head, and that it was watching him perched up on a tall, dead tree on the other side of the ravine. It really scared him, because he said he's never got a feeling like he did in that moment. He said it's like the bird was sizing him up, and decided whether or not to come after him. I possibly don't understand how you could just feel that from a bird, even if it was a rather large bird of prey, but this is just what he relayed to me. The entire time he was in view of this bird, it was closely watching him, almost as if it was calculating his next decision. It never moved from that branch though, and only moved its head to follow him in his movements. He just got a feeling that it wasn't right, and that he shouldn't be there. His gut instinct told him to get out of there. I'm not sure why I did not put much thought into this happening when it did, because this was years and years ago, but for whatever reason, when he retold me this experience of his, it was so much more profound to me. Possibly because I'm older now, which would make sense. He told me that he learned that there's something called a Thunderbird, and that people will talk about seeing it all over the United States. When I asked him more about the Thunderbird he himself was not quite sure. Some people report seeing a giant white bird. Others talk about seeing a prehistoric pterodactyl-like flying animal. His belief stands firm that he saw something that he believes didn't want to be seen. He really stands by that feeling, especially considering he's never seen a bird of that size and has never heard of a bird that looks exactly like this one did. It had a large pointed beak that dipped down at the end, just like a hawk, and had distinct white markings along the bottom of its neck and chest, but looked to be a mixture of black and brown. If he was guessing size, he would have said around 5 to 6 feet in height. It never spread its wings, so he wasn't able to get an accurate wingspan length. There's plenty of small wild animals out there with the area we were in, and there was nobody else around. I think we pulled off an old road that's no longer used since we were accustomed to just finding random roads that were either deserted or abandoned for best camping spots. It's where you get the best seclusion. He's not scared about it now, but it definitely opened up the book for him that there might be things out there that are undiscovered and that we don't know about yet. Whether it was truly something that had bad intentions, or maybe just an undiscovered bird. Either way, it sounded far more intelligent than just your standard bird. Maybe there is some truth to the whole Thunderbird phenomenon after all.